Devesh, thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Great. So we want to talk about lean practices in services. Now, ever since the 1950s, when Toyota started implementing lean manufacturing, lean has become quite a byword in manufacturing. But in services, it has always been a much harder situation. What are some of the reasons for that?
Well, maybe let's spend a moment on talking about what it is and how lean applies to services and why people should care. As you said, rightly, lean has had a long history in the manufacturing space. In the last decade or two, it's become much more common to see it applied to services. It's the same set of ideas which start with taking a customer perspective on a process and taking out waste from a process. It's a little harder in services to do that for a few different reasons, primarily rooted in one simple fact, which is in the manufacturing world, you have a physical product that's going through a manufacturing process. In the services context, it's not a product, it's actually the customer. It's a human being that's going through the process, which drives a few different differences. In the manufacturing context, the product is typically a widget. You're making the same thing a million times over. In the services context, each transaction is slightly different. They're not identical, and you have to account for that complexity when looking at that process and thinking about how to improve it. Also in manufacturing, the process of making the product is usually not visible to the customer. So you could, for example, have a process that has a high defect rate, but as long as you have a QA step at the end that takes out the defects, you can get a terrific product to the customer at a great price, and that's a perfectly acceptable trade-off. In services, however, typically in customer-facing processes, the customer sees everything. So think of yourself standing in a line at Starbucks. If there's a high error rate in that process, or if there's a delay in that process, you experience it immediately. There's no covering up for that.
Right.
And then a third point I'd highlight is from a practitioner's perspective, looking at a process and trying to improve it. In manufacturing, waste is very visible. You walk into a manufacturing plant, you will see waste if it exists. You'll see inventory piled up, you'll see defects, rejects, you'll see bottlenecks. If you walk into a services process, typically these days in companies, these are electronic processes. A lot of the workflow is electronic, so you might see rows and rows of cubicles with people working away at the process, but you wouldn't see waste physically, optically. And so you really have to map out the process carefully, understand the facts, lay out the value stream to try to figure out where the waste is. So those are a few of the ways in which it's different to apply lean to services and perhaps a little more subtle.
So Devesh, why should companies care about lean services?
So look, Mukul, as you know, we are in a challenging macroeconomic environment where growth has been difficult for a lot of companies and will probably continue to be for the foreseeable future. Competition's quite intense. And we're also in an era where consumer attitudes and perceptions are changing. Consumers and customers generally expect high levels of service. They're conditioned by the evolution of technology around us and the era of global, social, mobile. And companies have to adapt to respond to those needs. They have to be flexible, adaptive, be able to be responsive to what customers are asking for. When we actually look at service processes in companies, and I'd say both customer-facing ones and back-office ones, we actually don't find them to be that responsive to the needs of customers. They tend to be often slow, error-prone, and lead to customer dissatisfaction. Think about your own experience, let's say, in interacting with your bank or with your telecom company or with the healthcare system or even with government services. You'll find plenty of areas where processes could be a lot more responsive than they are. Lean is a set of techniques, as you know, rooted in the manufacturing world, which takes a look at processes from a customer's perspective and tries to help take out everything that the customer does not feel is value adding, is quote waste in the process. And so it can be a very powerful lever for companies to significantly improve both the cost, the efficiency, and the effectiveness of their service processes and make them much more responsive to customers' needs.
Now, let's assume that a company does succeed in identifying where the waste is and it gets it out of the service process. What kind of impact have you seen companies see on their bottom line?
We find actually lean efforts can be quite transformational. We see cost improvements in the range of often a quarter to a third of the cost of the process. Let me give you a very simple example in how we actually see this. We work a lot with telecom clients. If you've ever ordered a telecom service at home, you know it takes a long time to get that service up and running. One of the important steps in a telco installing a new service is actually the process of testing the service before they turn it up. It turns out actually that they typically test the service in almost 8 different segments before they turn it up, with each one of those tests being time-consuming and labor-intensive. It actually turns out, when you look at the process, that if you replace those 8 individual steps with one single end-to-end test, the error rates are so low that you're better off making that change, and you end up getting a significant improvement in cost in the 30 to 40% range, and you cut the cycle time by more than half. So that's an example of how you would take out cost using a lean lens. And actually, I'd emphasize one additional lesson from it, which is actually a lot of it is about taking cost, but it's not only about taking cost. It's actually about improving the quality of the interaction with the customer. So in that particular example, reducing the time to install by half is actually a huge benefit. You wait less for that service to be up and running. And lean, when done right, is impactful not just in cost. It's actually about whatever the customer deems to be value, which often is quality.
That's right. So that's great. That's a huge impact if you see 25 to 30% impact on the bottom line. But I wonder if we could go back to something you said a little earlier about how difficult it is to standardize things when you look at services. What are some of the challenges involved in standardizing operations in services?
So, as we talked about a little bit earlier, in the services context, you're not producing widgets. You're producing a very human customer experience. So you can tend to group your transactions into categories or kind of short list of categories, but you can never actually make them fully identical. And so what I'd say is standardization actually is one lever that tends to get used in lean. There are a host of other levers as well, from reducing unnecessary steps or duplicative steps or eliminating rework and handoffs and so on and so forth. Those are all an integral part of lean. Standardization is one part. The challenge with standardization, as I said, is you can take it to the nth degree in manufacturing. You can only take it so far in services.
Could you give any examples of companies that have done an outstanding job in implementing lean services?
Certainly, I can give you several examples from different industries where we've seen lean in action. Let me start maybe with a finance process, representative, I would say, of a lot of back office processes in companies like finance, HR, and IT. Accounts payable. It's a common process in a lot of companies where you pay invoices to the vendors of the companies. You typically have a large group of people who process these invoices and make sure that they get paid on time and accurately. One of the issues we typically find with those processes and several other transactional processes is the issue of variability. It's a classic lean waste, unevenness in a process, and we often test it in the following way. We create a dummy invoice, an artificially created transaction effectively and send it to 10 different operators. So it's the same transaction, sent it to 10 different people. And we repeat that 3 different times and time what level of variability see we across those people. And we are very frequently stunned by the results. We see 6 to 7x differences in the productivity of the best performer to the weakest performer. Not just 10 or 20% differences, but 6 to 7 times. As I said, that's a classic lean waste. You shouldn't have that level of variability, and it often happens because people are following different practices. They haven't been trained consistently. They're not following the same script, and actually, quite importantly, there is often no expectation for how long a transaction should take. Nobody's measuring it. They often measure performance at an aggregate level across the group, but individual performance on a transaction is often not measured and tracked and managed. So taking that out can be a really significant opportunity. Let me take another example from, let's say, a retail bank. You, I'm sure, have made customer support calls to your bank. Many processes have cyclicality in work volume. So the calls to a retail bank will often go up in volume and come down. Often these peaks are predictable. So in a retail bank that we worked with, for example, the middle of the week is when the calls peak. And the peak is actually quite high. It's 1.5 to 2 times the normal workload of that group. And if you don't handle that with extra capacity, you can lengthen the average wait time of the call. Customers get frustrated, they drop off, and that's not a great outcome. So often operations will handle this by staffing to peak. You keep around enough people so that you can handle the peak load, and you never miss a beat. But of course, those people are not doing much the rest of the days. A simple idea that you would see in Lean is the idea of cross-training across different groups to smooth out utilization. So for example, you could take the mortgage desk, cross-train them on handling support calls, and bring them into service whenever the call volume goes up very high. And of course, they can go back to their work, on the other days. So again, a very simple example that we've seen work in the banking space and actually in most customer service operations. Let me highlight another one from a very different industry, which is healthcare providers. If you've ever been to a hospital as an inpatient, you'll know that in the hospital's process flow, specialized tests like lab tests and blood tests and imaging can often be bottlenecks. In fact, in one hospital client that we worked with, if you measure the extra time that patients have to stay in the hospital just because of scheduling issues with these tests, it's in the range of 2 to 3 days. So patients are literally, stuck at the hospital extra time just because of the scheduling challenges around these tests and the bottlenecks. What we found also is that if you improve the communication across various departments so that you're not, when you're scheduling one of these tests, you're passing on more granular information about the criticality of the test for each individual patient, the likely time frame of stay, you can actually cut that waiting time in half. So these are pretty meaningful impacts, 3 different examples of cross-training, of improved scheduling, and of evenness or tackling unevenness in a process that grew up in the manufacturing world but can be very powerful in a services context.
Great. So let's say a company is sold on the idea of implementing lean services. They see the benefits, they see the value. When they actually try to implement a lean program, what are some of the most common obstacles that they face in doing so, and how can these be overcome?
I'd say there are 3 main things that are fairly straightforward and ones we see frequently. The first is actually finding where the lean opportunity is. As we were talking earlier, lean applied to services is a little different. It's a little more subtle, and the waste isn't quite visible. So it's actually ferreting out where the waste is happening. It takes a little bit of work getting to the facts, getting to the value stream, and so on. So that's one, just figuring out which processes is the waste in, what exactly is the waste, and how do you tackle it. I'd say a second very common issue is getting the organization to buy in, getting people to change. Ultimately, service processes are all about people, and it's about getting people to think differently. It's getting people to work differently, and that's not an easy thing. And there are ways to overcome it, which is to involve people in the process and make them feel ownership over the changes that they should be making. But that's a common challenge that we see. A third one I'd highlight is sustaining the changes. Even after lean efforts have been designed and implemented, we often see that it's very hard to sustain the improvements. If you don't monitor, track, and encourage the organization to continue the change and sustain it, there can be a reversion back to old practices. So I'd say those are a few of the common challenges we see.
Now, you've also identified in a report that I saw some success factors that companies need to pay attention to if they want to implement a lean program. Could you take us through a few of those?
So to start with, I'd say one of the common success factors for a strong lean program is getting a really good handle on how people spend their time. Believe it or not, actually, if you walk into most service operations, it's a simple question. How do your people spend your time? Most service operations actually don't track that very well. They may track it at a very macro level in the sense of understanding what accounts do people spend time on or what's their attendance level, but they don't track it down to an activity or a transaction level, which is really what you need to do lean effectively and to figure out what's value-added work versus non-value-added work. So getting a good handle on how people spend their time is actually quite important and helpful. And it doesn't require a big IT solution. It's often not a complicated answer, but a simple set of tools that can help you do that. I'd say a second success factor is very clear measurement and monitoring of success. So very clearly defining what you think success is for the effort, what measures or metrics or KPIs would you want to put in place, and then actually measuring them and making them transparent. Back to our earlier conversation, whether it's a cost metric or a quality metric around customer satisfaction or turnaround time or net promoter score or whatever it is that the right metric is, but getting transparency around that and ongoing tracking is extremely important. I'd say a third success factor is for the management of the company and the employees to not think of lean as a one-time project. It really is a mindset shift. Lean starts with the philosophy that processes can always be improved. Everything can always be improved. And so while there is typically a one-time step change benefit you get when you first start doing it, the fundamental principle underlying lean is that it's about continuous improvement. It's about changing all the time. It's about improving all the time. So I think going in with that mindset and instilling that mindset in the organization, I think, is another really important success factor.
Well, it seems that that last point you mentioned is very critical, but it almost also seems like one of the most challenging and the most difficult. How can companies develop a lean culture? You're absolutely right. It is actually one of the most challenging things to do in any transformation, but particularly in a lean-like effort where this is the changing what people do is kind of the fundamental improvement you're making. I'd say a few things that we've seen work very well. The first is for the executives, to really own the transformation and embody the behaviors that the transformation requires, to really be out there visibly. This is not something that you delegate to somebody else. It's not something that a specific lean group does for you. This is something that the executives of the company have to take on as a priority, own it, visibly be out in front on. A second thing is to pay really close attention to the human aspects of change. As I said, changing people and what they do and their attitudes is not trivial, but actually getting them involved in
the lean process and getting them to feel a sense of ownership is critical. Lean is about grassroots problem solving. It's about the people who are closest to the process thinking about what the improvement should be and then owning them and implementing them and seeing the results. So paying careful attention to the human side of change, I think, is another important enabler of culture change. And I'd say a third common success factor, if you will, that we see is communication. It's really important to communicate clearly right from the start of the effort, with clear objectives, a clear platform, a rationale for why you're doing what you're trying to do in the lean transformation. And then, keeping up the communication as you try out various things, communicating to the organization what's going on, what improvements are coming out, celebrating successes and wins so people feel good about the change, and bringing the entire organization along so they feel part of the effort.
So, Devesh, one last question. Let's assume that in the studio right now, in addition to just the two of us, we had the CEOs and chief operating officers of some really large services companies. If they want to get started on a lean initiative in their firms, what advice would you give them about how to get started?
I'd say to start with, first start with a very clear idea of what you're trying to do and why you're trying to do it. So a clear set of objectives and rationale. Why is lean important for them as a company or them as an industry? And what's the target? What's the set of targets? What do they want to drive the organization to? Once you've done that, I think then you can get into how do you actually tactically launch a lean effort. And typically what we see being effective is to take a couple of different parts of the company. It may be a couple of processes, it may be business units, it may be geographies, and then actually pilot something. Take a process, look at it through a lean lens, try to identify the sources of waste, actually pilot some improvements and see what results you get. We find that kind of an approach really helps you contextualize lean to your environment and build some fact base and a level of confidence that it can work within your company. Once you've done that, then I think you have a pretty good platform to launch something pretty broad. And you can then kind of sequence the rest of the processes or units that you're considering in waves. Design a clear rollout program or implementation program. Communicate, as I said, and bring the rest of the company along.
Great. Devesh, thank you so much for speaking with us today.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.